builder. Those are record triggered flows that are fired, and they use an auto launch flow. Can also fire an auto launch flow from a platform event. So somehow Salesforce emits a platform event, reads it, ties it to a flow. You can also schedule these auto launch flows. So that's called a schedule trigger. There's a good UI for doing that. You can also call auto launch flows from another flow or an API or even Apex or a flow orchestration. Essentially, an auto launch flow is just one that goes off and does its job. It doesn't need any interaction, takes in variables, and it outputs something conceivably. So one thing that we were thinking about would be useful to present to a group of developers is where flows sit in the order of execution within Salesforce. We all know the order of execution in Salesforce is large and not getting smaller. So it's important to know that before save flows run before Apex triggers. So if you modify something in the before save flow, you'll see that modification by the time it gets to your before trigger in Apex. After save flows are run after triggers. So kind of going on either side of Apex there. But they are run before some things that you may expect, like roll up summary fields. So if you're doing things where you tree up and after save flows, those roll up summary fields may not be executed yet. One benefit of flow is that Apex doesn't really give you out of the box with before save triggers, is that it allows you to control the order of before save flows. So there's actually a UI where you can go in there and say, okay, I want you to run this one first, I want you to run that one again, and just go through and actually configure that order. So that's a nice feature to have, and will help you keep some sanity as we're going through and making several of those flows. Over here is actually a Salesforce Ben graphic that illustrates all of the order of transaction. So you can see here's our before save flows, and where's our after save? So execute all after triggers. Well, look at all the stuff that happens after. There's after save flows. And you'll see there's also some recursion in here. So when you're trying to figure this stuff out, always remember there's docs and useful graphics made from the docs that other people have put together. Screen flows, so these are the kind of GUI config flows that you know in the flow builder. You can go through there, make certain screens, certain fields, they operate on records. You can expose screen flows in Lightning Web Components. You can expose screen flows in Lightning Out. You can expose them on record home, communities, everywhere. One interesting thing to note is that reactivity within screen flows is coming. So previously what would happen is each step of the screen flow rendered once when you initially navigated to it. And then if you changed the variable within that screen, you had to somehow trigger another next button click to get an update to it. They're changing this so that screen flows will be aware of variables changing that they're displaying. So imagine you've got a counter increment over here and an output text over here. You'll now see that incrementing on the same screen each time you press that button.
So they have a timeline for that?
I think that's
It's in beta now.
Yeah.
It's pretty limited.
So I see that as something that really helps LWC and screen flows get a lot closer together. This is just a funny thing I noted because I was working on an LWC that really needed a lookup field base component, and LWCs don't have it as a base component, but there is a component in screen flows. So yeah, there's a decent amount of starting points and base components within screen flows, and there's even a lot of people who are extending those if you're familiar with like the unofficial, there's a lot of people publishing components you can use in StreamFlows. And the last layer is really the flow orchestrator. So think of this as like everything we just talked about and zooming out one level. So this is like multiple users are interacting on a business process flow, and you're orchestrating together a bunch of different flows. So within this orchestration, you have the ability to have delays within it. So like you're creating a new task and waiting for someone to complete it before you go to the next step in the orchestration. And each one of those steps is really one of these types of flows. So it's tying all of this together and making it so like you can have these long running business processes that aren't a single transaction or a single interaction, like a auto launch flow or a ScreenFlow.
Has anyone here used Flow Orchestrator? It's a paid product, I think. It sounds really interesting, but I've never had a chance to use it.
You get 600 free orchestrations with Enterprise Edition or per year, and then it's contact BAE for pricing orchestrations after it.
Is that an
So I have no
execution or?
excuses.
One execution, so orchestration going from the start to the end, no matter how long it may take someone to do it.
So I figured you could debug it 500 times and then you get 100 actual.
Right.
Maybe they don't build for Sandbox, but who knows? So I thought this was an interesting lesson learned from Salesforce blogger Brian Kwong. I put the link on the bottom of this deck, but essentially he tries to sum up flows, and this first bullet point really resonated with me. So orchestrations have stages with steps. A step is a flow, and an orchestration can also have decision elements. Any resource other than the triggering record can be set from the value output of the flows called in a step. So you're trained together all of these steps within the orchestration, and all of them dump out to some kind of record, and the next action is triggered from that being completed and deciding, hey, what happened to this record? I'm going to go do the next thing. So imagine like you have, did I put it in there? I thought I did. There was a good graphic of essentially like a case coming in, the case going to a tier 1 support rep, going to a tier 2 support rep, then having a decision point where based upon like the tier 2 rep's evaluation, it went out and made another record. So it could go out and like potentially make a bug record or some other escalation. But this is a great article, and he actually goes through building a orchestration live. So it's a YouTube video of him going through and just going end to end so you can see everything. So I don't think we'll talk a ton about orchestrations or Flow Orchestrator in this session, because I feel like you could have its own for sure, but it's important to know that's there as a building block, or to put your building blocks together.
All right, and with that, I'll take over, and Jeff and I are going to go through some best practices. We, in general, through this presentation, are going to be more and more technical. So if you have questions, feel free to let us know. My part's not going to be that technical, but we're going to start getting into some actual flows. So I'm going to go over a handful of things, how to make flows that are easy to read, easy to work on, how error handling works, both like what happens when people hit errors and some tips on like how to handle errors that you can show to the users. We'll talk about source code control and other ways to track changes. A couple of little tips on filters and operators, and then Jeff's going to jump in and talk about Flow Debugger and some ways to work around flow limits. So first off, I think even though flows haven't been out for that long, I'm sure we've all run into problems editing flows. Things like this, where you're like, well, which flow do I go into? I don't know what all these do. Things like maybe slightly more specific. Okay, well, at least they're by record type now, but I still have no idea what these flows do. Decisions where you're like, what does do contracted task mean? I don't know. Slightly better. Well, at least now we know This is whether or not it's a contracted op. And hopefully nobody has, but I'm sure some of you have seen flows like this,
Oh my God. It's horrifying.
or like this. Both from actual client orgs I got permission to
Oh
use.
my God, really?
In the process of being rebuilt right now, but yes. So a couple of best practices that I've found along the way to help with this. First off, coming from the developer standpoint, I think a lot of the best practices that make code readable also apply to flows. So in code, you want to use names that are as descriptive as possible, not just for the flow, but for all the elements and variables inside of that. You want to rewrite large functions or methods. If it's hard to name the function, it's probably doing too much. Same thing with the flow. If it's hard to figure out the name for the flow, maybe you should break that up into some subflows that the flow then calls. Or maybe you need flow orchestrator. Use descriptions. Every flow I go into has no description about what it's supposed to do. But it is actually helpful whether somebody else is working on your stuff or you're looking at it a year later and you're like, wait, what was I trying to do with this flow? To have something. When you're talking about decisions, these are a couple of things I think make it easier. Name it based on the decision, not based on what you want to do afterwards. So like create task, ? Doesn't tell anybody what you're deciding on, right? We know you're going to create tasks after that because we can see the create records components. So something like this, stage changed, it's a good decision with the stages and a renamed default outcome so we know what each of those branches is going to do. I've started avoiding just doing yes, no. I know a lot of flows just have a decision that says yes, no. First off, you'll constantly get the error that yes has already been used as an API name. So at least change it to yes _ whatever that decision is, because then in the code, which we'll talk about in a minute, you can see what the yes is for. But I have been trying to avoid it completely because I find that decisions where each branch has a specific name instead of yes, no makes it much easier to read the flow. And then split complex decisions into multiple decisions. Like I know coming from workflow and process builder, you had to have like one decision for a list of actions. So people got in the habit of having like 10 filter criterias if that's how many they needed to decide something. I think if you're at the point where you can't figure out how to name the decision and the outcomes, you probably have too complex of a decision, and having like 2 decisions that are tied to each other would be much easier to read. When it comes to getting, creating, updating, deleting records, or doing assignments, I think a lot of people just leave it as get lead, get contact, update opportunity. Like that doesn't tell me much. How about get lead by record ID, get contact by email, something so I don't have to click into every get, create, or whatever in a flow to figure out what exactly it's doing. When you're updating records, maybe mention like what you're updating. When you're assigning stuff, what fields are you actually assigning? These kind of things make it so that just when you're at the flow high level view, it's much easier to read and see what's going on. A couple of last tips on readable flows. Assume someone else is going to edit them. It may be somebody else. It may just be you coming back 6 months later, not remembering what the heck you did. If you've got a really complex flow, I find it helps to draw it out. Sometimes you can figure out things that you're going to reuse multiple times and identify what should be subflows. And it doesn't take that long to like get a piece of paper or a whiteboard and draw out your flow. Add a descriptive name and a description to your flows. That helps when you're on the flow list view trying to figure out what each of them does. And then use constants instead of typing in text, numbers, or IDs. I know in general we want to avoid IDs, but like I have one client that creates a bunch of tasks and we use the user ID as the owner ID so that we don't have to have a get records to search the user every single time we want to create a task. And at first I was editing that flow, which was actually that crazy picture, something like 50 tasks in one flow, and each one had a different user ID of like who the task was being assigned to. So I was like, well, I don't know who this is. I have to query the user by ID every time to figure out whether or not the task is getting assigned to the right person. So I just created a constant for each user, put their name as the constant and then the user ID is the value. And now when you look at the task, you can see who it's being assigned to.
I'd also say you could put constants or numbers that you're using in flow in custom metadata. And
Yeah.
Then you don't have to act on the flow, you just change it.
All right, so now on to error handling. We'll talk about a few different things here, what happens when a flow fails, how to do fault handling, and a couple options on showing errors to users. So first off, errors by default will go to the last person who modified the flow. Who here is a sole admin and does not work with any other admins in their org? Okay, so you might be able to leave it with this option. I still don't recommend it, but for everybody else, you can go into process automation settings and change it so that it sends it to the Apex exception email recipients, which if you haven't set those up is also in setup under Apex exception emails. You can add any users or you can add external emails. So you could set up like a Google group or an email list and just have all your errors for your org go there, or you can send them to web to case or whatever you want to do, but a bunch of options for handling those errors and making sure you actually figure out where your flows are failing.
Is it limited to email or can you send it to like a Slack or
That one is limited to email, but Slack teams, our channels do have the ability to take emails. So granted, if you see the flow error emails, I don't know if you want to go into Slack, but there are options to do something like that from email if you want. So next is fault handling. So when a flow fails, typically when you're creating, updating, deleting a record, there is an option to have a fault path. So a couple of reasons to do that. First off, if you're doing screen flows, if you have an unhandled fault, it just gives them an error. No back button, they're done. And you have to go back. So like creating a custom screen that tells them what went wrong, then goes back, which is what I'll show you in a second, allows them to recover. Second, if you're doing other types of flows, you might want to save data. Like if you're halfway through a flow and it just fails, maybe you need a fault path to like save it to another object, send a custom email, or maybe you just skip over that and keep going with the rest of the stuff in the flow. I don't know, you do you. So we'll jump in here real quick and see what happens with the fault handling. So I've created a little Lightning component that calls a screen flow. So in this one, we're just handling an inbound call for lead creation. So let's say Jeff calls me and I come in here. Well, Jeff's at Snowy Tree. Click next. This is what a screen flow will typically show. Finally. So if you go in here, I'll open up this flow. When it got to this create new lead from inputs. So we can add a fault handling path. If you use the auto layout, you just click this add fault path from the context menu for that item. If you use the freeform layout, you'll notice that there's still a little node you can drag from here. And this will create a fault path if you link it to something else. So I'm gonna go in here, add a fault path, add a screen, add some display text so we can show the error. And then you can go in and in the global variable, which never seems to want to select the first time, there is a variable for the fault message. So we can save that. And activate that. And now if we come in here and create an inbound call, that's really persistent. Now we get our other screen with the error and the fault message. And we have previous and finish buttons. So I can go back and say, oh yeah, I forgot to put his last name. And then I can continue on. And the call loads the lead and lets me log a call. So showing errors to users. So sometimes you want the flow to fail, right? Maybe the flow is preventing them from doing something that you don't want them to do. There's a couple of options here. None of them are inherently obvious, I think, when you start creating flows. But obviously in the screen flow, you can have decisions, and then you can take the decision and send them to a screen that says, sorry, you can't do that, and lets them go back. You can also do things like make fields required, like the last name was actually an easier fix than doing fault handling on that last example. But you can also send a custom notification. You can use validation rules, or since a lot of people in here are developers, we can also use a little Apex trigger to add error to the record. So let's look at what a couple of those look like. So we have flow in here checking for named accounts. So in this developer org, I've got ABC company account, which has this custom field with the named account checkbox checked. And we want to keep people from creating leads related to this account. So we've gone in and set up a flow. And this is a record triggered flow, so it runs in the background. It searched for the named account by company. If a named account was found, then it sets user ID for the notification and then creates a custom notification. So let's see how this works. So save that. What? No error. But if you look closely, I now have a notification. So up here, I've now gotten a custom notification that says ABC company is named account. Please create a contact on the account instead. And if I click on that, it takes me to that lead that was just created. Now, obviously, you could customize that. Maybe you notify the person that owns the named account. Maybe you have a completely different use case and this example isn't relevant. But all you have to do is set up a custom notification and then use this custom notification action, which is built in, and set the input variables. Now, there is one gotcha if you've never done this before. You have to get the custom notification type ID, which Salesforce doesn't expose in setup. So you can query the custom notifications and get the ID, which you'll then need to put in that first field. The API name does not work. And then for the notification body, I used a text variable. And then notification title, I just typed it in. And then the user IDs was what I assigned in that last assignment. So in this case, I just took the user.id, which is another flow variable that is sometimes helpful, and assign that to the user IDs list. Now, another option is to go in and fill out a field and then have it throw an error. So this one requires a little bit of coding, approximately 7 lines, unless you follow actual trigger frameworks like a real Salesforce dev. And then obviously put this in a trigger handler and your trigger framework works. But this just looks to see if a lead that's been created has a flow error, and if so, it adds an error to the record. And then the flow is slightly different. All it does is adds the error to the lead. So this is just the lead that triggered the flow and filling out this flow error custom field. So if I create another you now get. You could do similar things with validation rules, but validation rules don't allow merge fields in the template. So you would have to have a generic error. But you can have a flow update a field that hits the validation rule and throws an error as well if you want something a little bit simpler. But if you want custom errors, that's my favorite way currently. In addition to that, there's built-in actions for sending an email. So you can just create an email and do your email template and send it to whoever you want. Next up, tracking flow changes. So tracking changes in admin, you may have noticed already on some of my examples, but I tend to put whatever I changed in the description. That way, when you're looking at a list of the flow versions, you have your own little like git commit history. Obviously, if you've got a description in there, there'd be a little bit more wording there, but it's still nice if something breaks or if someone publishes a new flow version and you're like, well, I want to see like what changed, to have a little note, you know what to look for, or you can find the right version to go back and activate if something's broken. Using source code control. I have a lot of clients, I'm sure a few of you are out there, where you just edit flows in production like a wild person. That's fine, especially if you've got a small org and don't mind hitting occasional flow errors, go for it. At least debug before you activate, please. But I highly recommend at least backing them up to Git, and if not, building them into your whole deployment process and getting people to actually work in dev sandboxes or their own Scratch orgs, and having that go through. Primarily because one, flows can be deleted, including flow versions, and we'll talk about why you might even want to delete flow versions in a second. Flows can easily be deployed with other stuff. So if you need an invocable with a flow, like if that's part of your deployment pipeline, it's much easier to get both of those out. You don't have to worry about timing the flow development with when the Apex releases are to your own org. It's also much easier to search. The only way I made it through debugging and figuring out that crazy flow that I showed earlier was I retrieved all the flows to VS Code. And then when he's like, hey, we need to change this one task, because that wasn't the only flow, there's several like that. I would search for whatever the task subject was in VS Code, find out the name of the flow, then go open it in the flow editor. Makes it much easier to figure out and debug stuff if you're dealing with an org with those or complicated flows. If people are just editing flows in production, you can also write a script to just retrieve from production on a regular basis. That way you've got a backup. This helps if you've got some people doing in production and you've got a deployment process, because then you can use like a GitHub action, for example, to retrieve it, update a production branch, and then you can compare branches. A couple of tips for deploying flows. Flows are deployed as inactive by default. So if you do add it to your deployment pipeline, you can either go into production orgs and in process automation settings, you can change it to deploy to active by default, or you have to remember to go to the flow and activate it every time you release a new version. That setting is not available in dev orgs as far as I can find. I'm not sure which orgs it's not in, but one thing to keep in mind, certain orgs may not have the ability to set it automatically. And lastly, there is a 50 version limit. So if you start hitting an error that says you can't create another flow, you might actually have to go delete some old flow versions. I've only hit that with a couple of clients so far, but if you're doing a lot of changes to your flow and deploying to your pipeline, you'll probably hit that limit. A couple of last tips before I hand it off to Jeff on filters and operators. The in filter, which came out just a couple releases ago and was fixed to be usable in 2 months, by my opinion, is a great way to do like relationship queries. So if you need to, for example, you have an opportunity flow, you want to get contact roles, and then you want to get all the contacts related to it. Well, you need a list of the contact IDs, and then you need to query it. So you can say ID is in contact IDs and do that get records lookup. this is what that whole design pattern looks like. So you have to get the contact roles, see if you got any contact roles, go through a loop and add them to a list, and then you could query the contacts. So one reason to do Apex is that's one line in Apex. But it's a great way to do it in flows if you need to get relationships like through a junction object. Two different ways to check if get records returns results. So that was one of the nodes in that last one. And this happens up often. You do a get records, then you're like, well, did it actually return anything? Because if so, I want to do this logic. Otherwise, I want to do this other logic. One is, and I think my favorite one lately is choose fields and assign variables option on the get records. Lets you check this box that says when no records are returned, set specified variables till null. And then you can go in and say, is my variable null? The easy way to tell. The other option is, if you create a number variable, you get this equals count operator, and then you can assign the count of how many records are in this loop that you went through and added everything to see if you've got 0, 1, more than one. This is also handy if you need to have different logic depending on how many are there. Like if there's one, it's fine. If there's 2 or more, then throw an error. To add to that, those assignment operators change a lot depending on what you have in the variable box. So if you're not seeing the operator you want, check your variable type. This is especially common where you go to create a variable and you forgot to check the box that says allow multiple values. And you think you have a list of records, but you actually just have one record, or you think you have a list of text, you just have one. But for like a single text variable, that's all you get. For a text collection, that's what you get. So also in that list, there's some pretty handy ones to do list operations, since you can't really do a bunch of for loops very easily with conditional logic. If you just have a context record or any kind of object record, you just get the equals. But if you have a list of records, you get all those list commands again. If you have a currency, you can add or subtract. If you have a number, you've got the add, subtract, and the equals count one that I mentioned. And with that, we'll hand it off to Jeff to talk about flow limits.
Can I ask a question about source control with flows?
Yeah.
The last time that I worked with flows and source control, doing a pull request and looking at a diff between 2 versions of a flow was just a mess, right? Rename a variable and all of a sudden, like 75% of the flow was flagged as differences. So we ended up just sort of, okay, just open up the flow and talk us through the change.
Yeah.
Okay, it doesn't sound like that's gotten any better.
No, that is the same. And
It's an XML file, right?
yeah, I mean, this is what that inbound call flow that we looked at earlier, that's what it looks like in VS Code. So good luck editing that. I wouldn't edit here. I don't do diffs here. Sometimes the diff is helpful because you can tell like a couple of things, but with any XML file, which goes for pretty much all metadata in Salesforce, if you like add a line, it thinks you like deleted the whole file and like typed in a line and then added a whole new section.
I feel like all the location X and location Y's change, like every time
They
you say
do,
it.
yeah.
And so then it's just like, well, wait, how do I,
When you
where's
move
the
it,
actual
yeah.
valuable change here that we need to review? So that's always been difficult.
Something that, so when I do pull requests that include flows, I'll usually, I mean, I've done like video, like Zoom recordings or Loom recordings if you use that describe it, or I've just done screenshots and then put in like text to describe what's changed.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of, I always get nervous when I'm like reviewing a PR with flow changes. And
Right.
So I'll like open up or I'll like pull it and deploy it. And it's not great.
Okay.
But it's helpful when you're like looking for where this field is used or whatever, all that
Right,
stuff.
right,
So I have a question. So it sounds like if you're trying to use source control, that's a problem. I'm new to source.
So the only challenge is if you're deploying stuff through source control and the CLI or the metadata API, and somebody's making changes in the org, you have to be careful you don't overwrite what they're changing.
Sure.
And then the challenge that we're talking about right now is just the difficulty of XML files in source control.
Yeah, it's like the type of file it is not very human. Tab, it just look, it's not easy to read as a human.
You saw how, like, there was the auto layout, right, or layout, so it keeps the graphical coordinates in that XML file, right? Is that, those, in my experience, seem to randomly change. So you're like, what's changed? Well, I relabeled a field, and now 300 lines of this XML are different than they were before. That's the sort of thing that I found hard, but that's just comparing before and after.
So it's not good at formatting the XML.
It's like a flow chart, Sarah was doing something.
Yeah.
But it's just the diff on it, so it's not
Yeah.
really-
Presentation.
Yeah, how do I run?
They're
Slideshow.
really drawing to it.
You're not.
Changing one from
No.
yeah,
That's interesting.
I don't know if VS Code and GitHub are any different, but I did a comparison in VS Code the other day, and it did pick up just a couple of
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
I'm not a GitHub expert or anything, I haven't done that side of it, but in VS Code, it did pick up just a couple, and said, here are your couple of tips.
It's a declarative.
It's declarative, you know.
Okay, so flow limits, like Paul mentioned, 50 versions of the flow, so debug instead of activating when possible, and so you don't have to go back and manually delete every version, the old versions. Executed elements per flow, so this used to be 2,000 until spring 23, and it's actually executed elements. So if you have a loop, and you do 10 things in the loop and you run the loop 100 times, it's actually 1,000 elements. And they finally got rid of that limit. So total flows per type, these are really big numbers and haven't really run into them. But of course, the flows are limited by all the other governor limits that you get in Salesforce. Okay, such as these. So total number of SQL queries, number of records you can pull in a query, same thing you would typically run into. The flow debugger, so when you debug a flow, the debug details show the results for every element. Super useful. I always debug before activating the flow. And then if you mark a variable as available for input, then when you run the flow debugger, you can enter that variable. Record ID, so this is a built-in or maybe semi-built-in variable. So it's handled by Salesforce, but you have to manually add it to the flow. So if you're running a flow, like a screen flow off a record ID will give you the record that the flow ran from. And then I'm going to jump over to a demo here. So and show you a couple of those things, the record ID and particularly using platform events to get around the query limit. So I created this custom object called a custom thing, and I just put some fields on here, and I loaded 1,000 of them. And so I've got this report that shows them, and you can see processed is empty, and I've got a simple flow that's going to copy some text to the other text. So I started, let me show you, with this flow, and in bad practice, I put a DML statement inside the loop. We had to do this because we actually ran into a customer org that had so many triggers that we would hit like 7 iterations through the loop and it would blow up. And so you would hit the query limits. And you could see, by the way, that it's smart enough to say, hey, that was a really bad idea. You put DML inside your loop. But I'm going to go ahead and debug this. And you'll see on the side, so no input variables, I'm just going to say run. And you'll see on the side the debug details. So for every element in your flow that runs, you'll see the output of that element and what it did. And so I'm going to say next, and we expect it to blow up because it's trying to do 1,000 DML statements in a loop. Not very fast, but sure enough, it blew up with no error handling. So, so instead, this flow that instead of running off the object runs off of a platform event. So when the platform event comes in, it will do a query of those custom things and it'll look for all the ones where the processed value is not equal to a passed-in value. So if we want to get all the ones that are not processed, then we'll just get the remaining set. And then I've actually got a variable on the platform event that says whether we're setting or resetting, and I do that decision, and then I either set the, what am I doing? Setting the, I hope this works. Setting the process to false, and then I update the record. And then I check if we hit the counter. So I've got a variable that I've added here, it's called I, a number variable. And then if we hit the limit, then we fire another platform event that started this. And if we don't hit the limit, then we just go ahead and end. So if I run this one, I need to run actually this flow that will create the platform event, and firing the platform event is just creating the platform event. So there's just a create records here, and it creates a record of the type platform event. So let's run this. So this is a screen flow. We're just going to say, I've got a toggle here that says set or reset. So it's already empty. So I'm going to say set and say next. And then we'll go back here and look at our report. And you can see that it's moving along, doing it in chunks of 100. Illustrating another point, flows are not fast.
This reminds me of watching Data Loader though.
Okay, and so they've now all been updated. And I can come over here and I still have my debug. Yeah, I'll just say, actually, I'll just debug again. So the flow that fires the platform event creates a platform event. I'll debug this, run it, and just leave it as reset. Click next. Now it's, you can see on the debugger all the elements and what they've done. If I go back to the report, now we should be seeing some records with the processed. Box is cleared. And it's going along, and we look over, over here, get the list view, go the other way. You'll see the other text is set. So that platform event is just, you know, you create it from the setup menu, platform events. And in this platform event, I just put a simple variable in here, a checkbox that says set or clear. And so that's what I'm using in the flow. And so this way, 1,000 records, million records, you can bypass the query limit. You just need to make your iteration in the flow small enough. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the record ID. So in this object, here we go. So I created a simple screen flow, and the screen flow runs off of, so the screen flow is connected to this button, and it just does a get record to get the record that it ran from, and that uses this record ID variable. So this is where it's semi-built in. So you have to actually create a variable called record ID, spelled exactly this way, capital I, lowercase d. It's got to be a text variable, but when you have it, Salesforce will populate it with the ID of the record that this was run from. So I'm on, this is T999, and if I click example, it's going to run that flow and say this is T999 because it used that record ID in the get to find the record that it ran from. Okay, any questions about that?
Did you click on record ID?
Yeah.
Don't forget to check available for input.
Thank you. Yes, critical.
Is record ID still case sensitive?
Yep.
Okay. I read into that.
Question on the debugger. I was using it the other day, had a screen flow. The screen had an LWC embedded in it. And you needed to select something, and I couldn't get past it in the debug. I was in a sandbox, so I just kind of threw an extra screen on there and had it print out what I needed to see. But is
Yeah.
there some other trick to kind of having in the debug, having the screen flow interact and talk with the LWC?
I don't know. Mike, have you run into that one?
I think there's a couple of things that don't work in the debugger, and I think the solution is do it in a dev sandbox or a Scratchworks so that you can activate it and test it. I don't know officially about LWC though.
And so debugger is fine for screen flows, for record triggered flows, but not for platform event flows.
The record trigger flow one, that's recent, right? I feel like we couldn't debug those.
I think
I feel like that's how I've hit the 50.
record triggered
Flow
flow where it
version
has a
of it.
lookup is recent. I think running them in the debugger has been around for a while, but I don't remember when it wasn't available.
Yeah.
The other thing I ran into the other day with scheduled flows debugging is like it will run one record. Good luck having it get the one record that you want to debug. So the tip is change the entry criteria and put a record ID in it and then debug it. And then after it works correctly, remove the record ID from your entry criteria.
Yeah, good point. When you debug, you do get the option to, okay, this is not a record triggered flow, but on a record triggered flow, you can skip the entry criteria and just cause it to run. And in a sandbox, you can run as another user also.
You can also choose which record you want, whether you want to create or update, all these things that would have been very helpful on a scheduled flow.
Yeah. And I've heard scheduled flows are kind of flaky in sandboxes, right?
I have not run into that.
Really? Maybe it was our flow. Okay, what's next? Flow permissions. So let me go back and do this. So that's not available in a screen flow. I think that's a screen flow too.
It's all screen flows.
Yeah, where's my? Should I
It's
click
under
on-
the gear. It should work on the screen flow too,
Yeah.
above the toolbox. Is what I think.
What do you?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, under advanced, you can have your flow run in system mode if you need to. So just like you would do in an Apex class. Okay, Lauren, over to you.
Cool. All right, any other questions or comments before we move on?
One thing that I've run into is like to debug a flow. If you haven't saved your flow and you debug it, you're gonna get the previous version of the, you don't have to activate your flow, but you do have to save it. And if you still have your tab open from your previous debug, which I always do, that's gonna keep going, that's gonna keep running the previous saved version of the flow. So the debugger is amazing, but I've run into that so many times. So just close the debug tab in your browser, make sure you save your changes, you don't have to activate, and then start a new debug to be able to use your new stuff.
I will add to that every once in a while, I'll do an operation that causes an unexpected error in Lightning on the page. First off, it makes the screen behind it go black and it just says, hit okay enough times, the screen gets brighter and then it takes you back to your flow. And then sometimes you can save it, but always save your flows as you're making changes. You never know when Lightning is going to bomb. Lose everything you already did without saving.
if you maybe hit escape at the wrong time and it closes the dialogue, you made 300 changes to. Yeah. Save
Yeah,
on it.
save as you go.
Sorry, I'm having issues.
I go to entire screen if you want.
Yeah, that's what I tried doing, but I didn't like that. Let's see. To read an article.
You might not have given it permission.
All right. 1 second, everybody. I can share one window though.
Is that enough for you?
Well, I'm gonna show VS Code instead. Wait, sorry, give me a second. I'm gonna figure this out.
Jonathan, are you in and set up?
I'm ready to go. I just don't have access to screen share in the meeting.
Oh, Jeff, you got it?
And do you want me to- would it be better if I just jump up here?
Yeah, just so everybody else can hear you.
I used to-
You can actually come here if you want. This is the mic.
Oh, all right.
Okay, Jonathan, you should be able to share.
All right.
Drama in the back.
No, that's not developers.
All right. Hey, I'm Jonathan Green. I'm the Salesforce architect at Compassion International, and I've been leaning in to flows. My background is in development. And so my question has been, when does it make sense to go with a flow rather than writing code? And my hope is that everybody flows like a developer, right? Like you don't want to query inside of a loop. Well, you know that if you've been writing Apex. It's easy to not know that, right? If you're not used to hitting those errors with code. So you got to think about, like, this is going to execute as if it were written in Apex. All right, the use case for this first demo that I wanted to show is we needed a contact us form. We needed to create a case. So you go with web to case, right? Salesforce just spits out an HTML form. And then I found out we needed to put this on a website where the content management system behind this site puts the entire web page inside of HTML form tags. And you can't have a form inside of another form. So web to case won't work. So I looked at a couple different options. I looked at a chat bot, and maybe that's what we could use. And then I looked at using a screen flow outside of Salesforce for unauthenticated users. All right, Salesforce has something in Lightning called Lightning Out. This is how you can expose a Lightning component inside of Visualforce in an org that's still on Classic. It's a Aura app that is tagged as available for Lightning Out. You can include this outside of Salesforce. Now you have to handle the authentication, which we'll get to in a minute. But this is my Lightning, this is my Aura component for Lightning Out. It's really simple. All it does is say that it requires Lightning Flow and a Lightning component. I did use an Aura component. You could do the same thing with an LWC. This was just a quick proof of concept. Here's my Aura component. It accepts two attributes, the flow name and the flow parameters. And then the controller for this just says, hey, for that flow, start the flow with the flow name and pass the flow parameters. Here's what it looks like. This is a personal website of mine that, okay, Jeff the Chicken. It's not affiliated with anybody. But I tinkered with it. Everything inside of this blue box. This is a flow running in Salesforce on a third-party website that is clearly not a Salesforce site. So this is create a case. It's a multi-screen flow. So I can put in my name. It's got the toggles. I personally like this a lot better than the web to case form because you can put in all the interactivity. You can have it work like a wizard where it guides them along the process. You can put in the decision steps. You can say, well, do I want my phone or do I want my email? Oh, number lock. And contact. This is creating a case inside of my sandbox. Here's my case number, right? That's done. It's a nice interactive way of having a contact us form. Well, I built the Lightning Out component so that it accepts the name of the flow. You actually can see the name of the flow as a URL parameter on my website here. We can do a different one. This is a really simple flow where the flow defaults the name to Joe, but we could pass it a different URL parameter. And this web page is just passing it through to the Lightning component. So it's taking the name that's up in the URL and it's just passing it right through to the flow in Salesforce. So you can have information passed back and forth through the Lightning out app to the Lightning components to the flow and all the way back out to your website. I don't know if anyone has worked with external services in Salesforce. I was experimenting with those. Those work too. So here's a flow that calls an external service. There is a public available API on CatFacts. So here we go. Well, we won't do 10, but let's go for 3 CatFacts. All right, this website does not have to make an API call. Flow Builder, this is no code to do this, right? In the flow. Here we go. So it called the API. It's iterating through the results of that API, and all exposed publicly to a user that's not authenticated into Salesforce. So your security red flag should be going off that unauthenticated users are running internal flows inside of Salesforce. So if you go with this route, while it's really fun and creative, to be really aware of what those flows are doing because they could be exposed publicly, right? Especially if you're going to run it in system mode with access to all of your data. So things to be aware of. The other flow that I wanted to show, this is what that flow is. Just like with like an embedded service, like an embedded chat, you do have to enable settings in Salesforce. So there's some minimal security that's there. And then the last piece I want to show on this one, this is all the code that's necessary to make this work, right? This is Lightning Out stuff. You have to include this script for Lightning Out. You put a div on your Lightning Out Aura app to be displayed. And then there's this piece of JavaScript code, right, that tells Salesforce. And you'll notice I'm not passing in a session ID to the user. You can do that. You can have your server authenticate, right, via OAuth to the Salesforce server and pass that session ID in to the widget. I just have a URL for a community, and it's using the public site user associated with that, sorry, not a community, an experience site. So it's using the guest user of that experience site to get the access. That's the other way you can control access to the flow, right? You set up something like a guest user that's going to be the running user of that flow, and you give that guest user the specific access, right, that you want that user to have. The second example that I have is I had fun with a chatbot lately. And this is, okay, it's not a good chatbot because it never offers to transfer you to a human. If you ever build a chatbot, always give the option to speak to a human. But I wanted to figure out a chatbot to provide customer self-service, or for us, supporter self-service, because we're a nonprofit. So here we go. We've got Skippy, Compassion's digital assistant. How can I help? And there's stuff that's built into Flow where it can search knowledge articles for you. So I want to know if Compassion works in Haiti. Now, this isn't anything fancy. Actually, everything in this demo that I'm showing with the chatbot is all no code. I didn't write any code at all to make this work. Here's a knowledge article. It'll spit out a blurb about that information. I can click to read more. Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you, chatbot. Now, as I asked around and said, what are the scenarios where we'd want a supporter to be able to get their own question answered without calling us on the phone? Right? We want call deflection and case deflection for customer service. Most of those things, we need to authenticate who that person is. And right now, we're not using an experience site for our supporters. So how could we authenticate? So here's what I built in, and I used another external service with Twilio. So Twilio has their Verify API, right? When you get a text message that says, here's your code, right, to log into the system you're trying to log into, Twilio has an API for that. Twilio has made all of their APIs to open spec API specs. So you can just take that, put it into Salesforce. Salesforce builds the Apex class for you, and your flow can now call that API with no code on your part. If you like to write code, you can also call that API and that web service via code based on what they created. So I know a cryptic number is not the best thing for customer support, but this demo. So it's going to ask if this is me. It's got some of my information masked out. And now it's checking because our CRM has my cell phone number in it. Oh, hold on, I just got a text message. Your Skippy from Compassion verification code is 617520. So this authentication through Twilio to my cell phone is all a no-code solution using a flow. Right? So the flow accepts the input parameter of my account It pulls the cell phone number off of my account, passes that through to Twilio. And then it passes the account and the code that I just put in to verify that code with Twilio through that flow. Now I'm authenticated. Now I can get in. Now I can view more personal information, some PII, because I've authenticated with passwordless authentication. And then it's just a chatbot from here. So I can interact with some common questions and answers. I could show that flow. It's actually really simple though. This is the call to Twilio. This is what that flow looks like, right? We build a message for that external service where we say, we're going to send it to the phone number that was passed in, and it's going to be an SMS. So this is the body of the request to that Twilio API that Salesforce has exposed as a web service. So all we have to do is create an action. I don't have to write any code for this integration. Salesforce built all that code when I uploaded the Open API spec. So now I can call it from the flow. And to do that, it looks just like this. So you just click, you create a new action, and you can actually see here everything that's available to Twilio. Here we go. So there's the verification, which will send the first text message. And then there's the verification check. So these two methods are exposed from the external web service, the external service in Salesforce. All right, those are my demos of some fun flows that I've done lately. I'm happy for any questions, but I know we have more to do as well.
That dialogue screen you're in, I'm just not familiar with that.
Which dialogue?
The screen that looked like almost like a flow builder.
Oh, yes. Okay, sorry.
What
Let
is that?
me share again. So that is, let me share my entire screen. This screen here.
Mhm.
Yeah, all right. So this is the chatbot builder. So if you have, well, depending on your license, you may have Einstein bot available for chat. Now this can be used in an embedded chat, which is what I did here, right? So it can be used in an old chat, right? If you've got an old chat through the old way of doing it without an embedded service, or we open up a chat, opens up a new window, chatbots can be used there. This can be used through the integration with Facebook Messenger, can be used with WhatsApp. You can use bots with text messages. So this is Salesforce's bot builder. It's not a bot. It's not. It's dialogues that point back and forth to each other, which you'd think would be a flow. It's not a flow. So this is a totally different tool. But so
It's almost like a combination of like knowledge base and flow, right? Because you're gonna have to have a lot more content than just like what would be in a flow.
right, and this can be a mess. So I know this isn't about chatbots, but while we're
Yeah.
here, right? So this is the main menu. This is what I started with. And so each one of these is a different defined dialogue. There is minor, look at that, Einstein on or off. All right, you just turn on Einstein, it's AI. This is about natural language processing. So you have, if you want to use, you throw in like, well, what are at least 25 ways that somebody might ask to go back to the main menu? Okay, I came up with 25 ways to do that. And the idea is that the more that it's used, the more the system is going to recognize other things that people might type in to get to that same dialogue. The dialogue that does this flow, and it calls this flow, is this here. So there's a question, what's your supporter number? And then it puts out a message. It takes that supporter number and stores it into a variable that's called supporter number text. It says, it has a message out there that puts that merge, like that in as a merge field. And then it has the action where it searches the account. That's not a flow. That's part of the bot.
Can you open up the map page? If you click on where it says detail, the down arrow next to detail near the top.
This one here? Oh, I can, but I never have before. So you better know where we're going.
It looks like a
Everything
flow.
explodes.
Okay, all right.
It makes it like.
Oh, brilliant, okay.
Oh, that's cool. Interesting.
So I sort of imagine that under the hood, this is a flow, the same way that Process Builder under the hood really is a flow. So this is something, I put this together in a couple of days between meetings. Bots are actually really easy to build, but it takes some getting used to because it is such a different interface for building it as compared to a flow. If we get down to where I put the supporter number in, I confirm that it was me. Here's where I click to run a flow. So there's a new action, the type was flow. I just chose what flow, and then I could pick what data I wanted to put into the inputs that were there. So I passed in an account, and then I accepted out the phone number.
on the other side of that flow.
Nice.
So it masked the phone number, I think, that came back. Let's say we sent a text message to this phone number, but if you can guess I don't want the system to expose my personal cell phone number to someone who happens to be on chat. So the flow masks out that cell phone number. It puts like asterisks in the middle to hide that.
Interesting.
But that's it. It's so easy. If you're building a chat bot to call a flow, you just click to add a new action and choose the flow, and then you can pass data in and retrieve data back out.
Cool. Yeah, I've never seen that. I've never even seen that demo before, so it's really interesting.
Thanks, Jonathan. With that,
Yeah,
Lauren?
thank you.
See-
All right, let's see if I can share my screen
Yeah,
to update.
always
Classic.
update Chrome every day.
I feel like there have been a lot of Chrome updates lately, and I felt a little resentful today, so I didn't click the button. But alas, Chrome wins. Is someone talking to me? No. Okay, cool. So I have pretty much adapted like a project I worked on where the data had to live external to Salesforce, but within Salesforce, we wanted our users to kind of interact with it. So I have a screen flow that, well, I adapted it to my hobbies during COVID, which were one of my hobbies during COVID, which was cocktail making. So I found like a free database, free API called, I think it's called Cocktail DB. So basically I'll walk you through this screen flow I built that invokes an API and then does a call out, and then with the response, either you can do a couple things or it'll just display the one cocktail that was chosen. So let me just zoom in a little. Okay, cool. So I have this little screen flow called Barback Buddy, and you can pick your cocktail through a number of ways. So you can find it by name, you can just browse some popular ones, you can have it surprise you, or you can select a spirit or a combination of spirits and it will give you a list to choose from. So first, I'll go through the browse popular cocktails, click next. Right now, it's invoking an Apex method through an Apex action. It's doing a call out, and it returns a list from that API of what they consider, well, what they keep in their database that points to the endpoint for, I think, popular or something. So here I will choose, does anyone have a favorite on the list they would like to see the recipe for? We have Mojito, Old Fashioned, Long Island Iced Tea, Negroni.
I want to know what an Alexander is.
Alexander, cool. So we click Alexander, and because this is a list of many options, it then has to do another call out to get the details of the recipe that will be displayed in the next screen. So we'll see what an Alexander is. Click next. And an Alexander is these ingredients. So basically, I'll show you in a second what the API's data looks like. But basically what I've done is taken the response from that last call out, which I actually got the ID of the specific drink that we were looking up. I got all those details, and then I essentially created a page that displays like one instance of a drink object. So here we have the details here, and then a little video that comes in. This is all just like from the API. Another way to do it is we could, I should just hit finish. We can do it by cocktail name. So does anyone have a favorite cocktail they want to look at by name?
Margarita.
All right, margarita. Cool. So right now, oh, we have many different margarita options returned. I'll select the smashed watermelon margarita for you, and then it does a call out, and it'll kind of do the same display of the data here. So here is first the API, the cocktail database docs. So it has these different endpoints where I can do, I believe they're all just going to be get methods, but basically there are different endpoints and different types of data I can essentially, or like different shapes of data that I can receive from the different endpoints. And so I have, if you'll see, like I have like look up a random cocktail, which is a surprise me that I put in, then look up ingredient by ID. And then there's like, basically, so this is what the endpoint looks like, and let's test it. And this is what a response with a cocktail will look like. So I essentially took this data here and created an Apex class called, sorry, I don't know if I'm like going through this in a helpful way. Is this good? Okay. I basically took the different data in this nested JSON, and I made my own drink class where I mirrored the same exact variable names, and I made it essentially an Apex defined variable that I can then call through the flow. And the way that I do that is I just put Aura enabled next to each of these variables. And then when I go to my flow, I can define an Apex variable. You'll see this Apex defined collection variables that essentially just pulls in, I can't change it here, but I can pull in any of these. Yeah, click Apex defined, and then any Apex classes that have that notation of at Aura something,
Enabled.
at Aura enabled will show up here. So then I can actually have different variables that are defined code, which is like super powerful, right? Because I then don't have to create different like all different variables within the flow itself. I can define that in the code and then have that pass in a clean way. So the way that I'm actually doing the call out is, I'll just walk through the flow. Basically, we have this screen here, which is where you select. We have some conditionally displayed inputs here. So we'll need the name, obviously, as well as the selected spirits if we're choosing either of those. Something that I've tried to like use, I think decisions can be pretty expensive in Flow. So I try to use Flow formulas as much as I can instead of decisions. So basically here I have the search type. So I've named the thing that's selected here, like how do you want to find it? I consider this the search type. So then I assign the search type to the one that was selected to a variable called selected search type. And in the get cocktails Apex action, I'm calling an invoked Apex method, which I'll show you in a second. And I'm passing in this formula, flow formula called URL params formula. So what that does is it takes the selected search type, and based on the selected search type in that initial screen, it assigns the URL parameters that go at the end of the endpoint so that I'm, when I do my call out, I'm calling out to the correct endpoint to get the right data that I want. So for example, random is always going to be the same, popular is always going to be the same, but if I search by a specific cocktail name, I have to make sure I include that here. And the same with the spirits. They have like slightly different endpoints. You'll see like filter, search, whatever. Then I call my Apex action, pass in that formula, and then I assign the response from the request to an output to a variable, collection variable called drinks. So let's see. So then in the code, what that looks like is I have this class called cocktail service, and this method, which is an invocable method, you always have to have that annotation. Is that the right term for that? Yeah, you have to always have that annotation there. I have my method called get cocktails that essentially takes in that endpoint that I defined from the selection, the user selection, and or input. Then it uses that to do the call out. So here I'm creating a request called build a request. And essentially I'm like setting the REST method, then setting the call out through a named credential. The URL parameters, this value is formula that I just displayed. So that's passed in to the Apex method. And then I have, I'm building a request here, I have the password, all that stuff. And then I make the call out, and then from making the call out, I need to do some better error handling, but I do the call out and then always have to do better error handling. And then if the response is successful, which will be a response code between 200 and 300 or less than 300, then I'm going to add each drink in the list to a list of lists and pass that back to the flow. Salesforce Flow invocable methods, and if someone here knows the exact reason why, please fill us in, but they require that you both, like the parameters for the methods are always going to be lists, and the like if you're passing something back, that always has to be a list too. So if I want to pass multiple drinks back, I have to pass a list of drinks. What I've read is that because Salesforce automatically bulkifies their flows, they want you to do lists on both sides. I understand what those words mean, but I don't understand if it's bulkified, why they would still, like if it's still processing one record, because whenever I've done this, I'm always just getting the first record in that list. Like why, even if it's bulkified, does it need to have a list? I don't understand.
On a screen flow like this, it probably doesn't make much sense because you're not going to be able to like submit 500 screen flow submissions at the same time. But like we showed platform events and record trigger flows where if you do an insert with 100 records and it calls 100 record trigger flows, then I imagine on the back end, Salesforce is putting those all together and sending the list to the Apex class. So it doesn't have to call the Apex class 100 times.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll buy that.
I've only seen it happen in practice, 10% of the time. Like I've seen it call it in loops.
Yeah.
With one request that each list of requests most of the time.
Wait, you've seen what in practice?
It rarely calls it in a bulkified fashion,
Oh.
but it does ask for you to provide it in a bulkified fashion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think a lot of flows weren't bulkified until it was a spring release. So I think they're adding that more in, but I guess they enforced bulkification of the invocables from the beginning.
It makes sense, like it's the same way you would not write a trigger based on one record. You write a trigger based on the list of records.
Yeah.
It's a request for record. But it does make it awkward, and it does make you wonder what the hell you're doing, because you're doing a lot of work for something that is difficult to test outside of writing like Apex test that does send a multiple requests.
So then is this bad practice for me to just take this list and only ever deal with the first one?
It's literally in the docs.
Yeah.
This is the thing you can like argue about on the internet if you care to do that. But like there's Salesforce docs that do the exact practice.
It's
So it's prevalent for sure, but it doesn't abide by the API. Like at some point you could get a bug.
You can also change it to a auto-launched flow and then try calling it from Apex with a list and with different parameters on each one and see what happens.
oh, so like try to shove a bunch of records at or like requests at it.
Like imagine if you change this to like an auto-launch flow that like emailed the results of whatever somebody requested, then you could theoretically create like a Apex class that sends 100 requests flow and then the flow calls that. These are things
Interesting.
I haven't seen any documentation on how they're actually architecting this on the back end, which is why this is all guessing. But
Right.
that's what I
right.
think they're trying to do.
I don't know if you're supposed to have a side effect from it. Flow, right? Like, I don't think you're supposed to, it's only after.
Oh, what?
I don't know what that sentence means.
It's a side effect, like sending an email or something.
Oh.
Well, I was saying doing an auto launch flow, which is one that's not triggered by anything, you call it in Apex. But yes, actions and record updates besides the triggering record need to be in after save flow.
You said that the formulas are better performance than the decision. Did you run into like some limitation on like a big flow and had to switch them over? Like how did you come across that?
I think that I feel like I'm super biased against decisions. Yeah, they're pretty slow. And formulas, I can like what I like about a formula is that. So here I can show you another version of this. So I had my first version of this when I was just kind of like throwing this together to like make sure it worked before kind of refining it. The way I was assigning the endpoint was through this decision. And then if it's by spirit, assign these variables. If it's blah, 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 you know? So like even just the visual, I guess like processing that takes, as well as like the decision, like I'm pretty sure I've read that decisions are slow, but maybe it's just a bias I have. But I believe that they are not as performant as formulas. I will check that. But instead of having this, so if you see like, here's the screen, here's the Apex action, I replace all that with just this assignment. And then what I like about formulas is like, they'll just be evaluated when they're called, right? So like this formula, formulas are decisions, right? Like logic is decisions. So I guess, I don't know. I just think it's also like, it's easier to see all the decisions at once here. So whenever possible, I try personally to use these Salesforce formulas because I think they're like pretty powerful and also just like less space on the screen.
I think I would agree. And I think I would sum that up by saying like, whenever the values are changing or the variables are changing, but you're going to do the same actions regardless, formulas are way easier to create. They make the flow simpler. If you're actually changing which actions you're doing and which flow components you need, then you kind of need a decision because you have to go down different branches.
Yeah, there are definitely a time and place for decisions, but I do think that they often overused, like where you can see a bunch of decisions like within loops and they have like nested decisions, and that's kind of where I've seen, and I've built stuff like that. Like I've like pushed flow to like, so it's to its limits at points, and like it's a lot of fun and it's cool, but it's also really hard to maintain and kind of crazy to look at.
When you wind up creating the same decision over and over again.
Yeah, that too. But I do have a decision here. So then I do the first call out, get the cocktails, and then if it's a cocktail, if it's a request that would return multiple, I essentially make a decision about whether I need to loop through them and build that list. So like when we're looking at the random or by popular, whatever, you need to loop through that, create a list, and then, but if I just do like by name or by, well, that create a list. If I do like random one and I know there's just going to be one response, I don't have to do all that looping. I can just buy this no path. I can just bypass that and show, no, sorry, I'm showing the wrong thing. I can, what am I doing? Oh, actually, because it's a list, I have to loop through them either way, but do this second display drink selection screen. So I have two decisions in here. So basically I have the first one, the call out return cocktails. If no, it points to an error screen that I built. If yes, it has to loop through them because either way it's going to return that list of lists. then it assigns the drinks to that apex defined variable, I believe. And then it displays them in that display screen if there's more than one. Something that's cool that I wanted to call out is, and I think I could simplify this because I did use the same call out for both times I'm doing the call out, but something I did want to show is assigning the drink details. So I thought this was super cool because I could actually create like an instance here. So I'm basically like, this drink instance is the apex defined variable. So it's essentially like this is like object-oriented programming, like pulled in, like in your face in Flow. Like it's pretty cool. Like you're creating like instances. And I assign it here to this drink instance, which is defined by my apex class drink that I showed you earlier before. And then what I'm doing is I'm just displaying in that final screen the drink instance details, right? So like I'm just showing the drink instance dot drink s string drink, which is like the name. I create a little detail header, which is kind of pointless at this point, but whatever. And then I created a drink detail.
And that's with the directions
variable.
and everything. And then the drink image is on the right.
Yeah, then the drink image. So then if we look at these, one of them I think is a text template. Yeah, text template. The drink detail is, right, let's get shaken. Serve your favorite drink instance dot glass. And then here I just have the whole, like all of the details of that one instance of that class here, and that's just what I'm displaying. Which I learned this by building this demo because I was like, I want to build it, and I want to learn something from this too. So I thought that was super cool. I was like, oh wow, this is like, Flow is super cool because it really is like you can make it the cross between like dev, like a lot of code heavy stuff, and declarative stuff. And I think it's like a really cool opportunity for admins and devs to design and build stuff together and be like, if an admin is like, I don't understand what's going on, and I need to like take this response and do something with it, then like I'm as a developer not necessarily doing my job well to support like how declarative and how like click to dev stuff should be in this platform. So anyway, I got really excited by that, like 1 p.m. on Saturday. And then I created the drink detail screen, and then I also created a little error screen. So if I do a little error margarita, let's error this out because there's not going to be a cocktail named that. Then I have my little error screen.
Drink screen.
Yeah, so yeah, I always have to put a little Seinfeld reference, but I feel like that's getting super old at this point. Cool, so that's my screen flow invocable method apex defined variables demo.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
An Apex class can only have one invocable method in it, right? Yeah,
I
okay.
believe so.
So that's a catch. If you've got 4 different things that you want your flow to do, you're looking at 3 or 4 different Apex classes because each one gets an invocable method. Or you have one invocable method that accepts a parameter that says, what should I do here? And then you have a switch statement. And so there are ways to work within it, but you still only get that one invocable method per Apex class.
You know what was,
I haven't
yeah.
actually hit that limit. But I guess I haven't tried anything.
It won't deploy if you try to put 2 in.
I haven't hit that one.
Class specifies the shape of the inputs and outputs, that's why it's one parameter. So it's just like the function of inputs and outputs, but you're going to do, you can flag between those, so the only problem would be like, maybe then you have a lot of optional outputs that
Right.
would confuse the manager.
Right.
I ran into something super funky that's like kind of related to this, where I have my invocable method, and then I have my drink Apex defined like class, right? Like Apex defined variable, whatever you want to call it. And because this invocable method is returning a list of that class, I have to have, so usually just to have an Apex defined variable, you just have to have Aura enabled.
Hmm.
But I have to also just like randomly put at invocable variable in this class for it to work. So if I remove this and then go back, so if I like delete this, and then I deploy it and go back to the flow, let's see. Sometimes it's so fast and sometimes it's so slow, okay. And then I go back to my flow and I refresh it. I hit save. It was, yeah, it should be there. Get has action. We can't find the action with the name. So even the invoked method fails if the thing that I'm returning doesn't have invocable variable, which is the annotation for the actual like variables. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting thing. I was like, I've never run into that before. So I feel like I'm kind of combining two use cases. So maybe that's like a wonky thing. I don't know.
What an obfuscated error message in Apex.
So
Yeah.
we did have there was a question in the chat.
Oh yeah.
Has anyone we have a flow calling a Lightning Web Component. Are there any best practices in that case?
I don't know that I have any best practices. Embedding a Lightning Web Component in a flow works. I haven't tried passing like messages to a Lightning Web Component that's on the same page.
I think it's like genericize your LWC if you can, so you can use it across multiple flows and do the highest level best practice. And then the inputs and outputs of the component manageable to the admin.
I'll say something, yeah, I've done it a couple times. I'll say something that's super annoying also about just like combining code and flow is you kind of get like set in whatever your variables are. So down here I have this, so this invoked method takes a drink request, illicit drink request called request detail. And I'm not using like this variable or this variable anymore, but because they're referenced in previous versions, I can't remove them from the code until I delete those flow versions. So they're like weird, like kind of thoughtful in that way, and also like thoughtful, like what I'm gonna do is just create a whole new flow, delete the other ones instead of a new version, delete the code. So you have to like kind of know how to work with it, and it's wonky. But I know the same is true for Lightning Web Components. Like if you have an input output, you can't remove it if it's in versions.
I would say that with LWCs, I have seen so many custom built LWCs that could have just been flows.
Yeah.
So screen flows is a really good option if you need a simple custom visual, so like a custom UI on the screen. If it gets too complicated, or if you need to open a dialogue, right? There's various things that a flow can't do, and then you'd go to an LWC. But it's a nice option to go to for a really quick end-to-end declarative way to build that flow, even if your logic has to be in Apex, because you can just have an invocable method, right?
Yeah.
You might logic in Apex. And instead of building an LWC, you just use your flow and then pass those variables in.
Yeah.
Actually, you can event out of the LWC to say like, hey, I want the flow to advance or go previously.
Mhm. Yeah. Cool. So that's my little thing.
Thank you to all the presenters. If you have any more questions, feel free to talk to us as we get into the mini hack. Anybody that's joining us virtually, feel free to keep posting stuff in the chat. I'm going to bring up the mini hack options. So we've got a couple of different choices. They're all designed to be relatively quick after it lets me share my screen.
seeing your metaverse like, screen.
I think I shared the wrong screen. There we go. Okay, so whether you're virtual or here in person, if you got your developer options on Mini Hacks, we will be monitoring for everybody online and walking around to help anybody that's here. If there's food or drinks left and you're in person, feel free to keep helping yourself. Otherwise, we have to take it all.
And there is a fridge, sorry to interrupt you. There is a fridge in the kitchen back there that has more drinks in it. Those may be getting a little warm if they're like some on the wall and some back there.
Yeah.
Alcoholic and non-alcoholic stuff, so help yourself, please.
So the three options we put together kind of start from relatively simple to some that require a little bit of coding. So the screen flow is just similar to what I demonstrated with inbound call, but designed to start from a lead so you don't have to do the lightning component part. Create a screen flow that can update fields, log a call, do anything else, feel free to go crazy. Or a record trigger flow, we thought opportunity naming conventions is one of those examples that's like everywhere. Like we want to make sure people are standard. So a good way flows is just a before save that updates fields. And then lastly, if you go to that tiny URL, there's an Apex class that has not been turned into an invocable yet. It's already structured kind of the way you would need it for an invocable. So it handles lists, returns lists, that kind of stuff. But you'll have to use some of those annotations that Lauren was going over to an invocable class. And then you can create a screen flow that lets you create your own custom convert lead screen. So with that, feel free to pair up if you want. If you don't have a laptop, join somebody that has one. And we'll just be talking through the rest of this.